competencies. For us to learn more about these competencies and what is it for, we have prepared a presentation for you to watch and listen. In this way, you will have a consistent understanding of this content.
The code means the MELC is either merged or rephrased. For example, in grade 3, quarter 1, the first competency does not have a code because this competency was rephrased. In quarter 2 of the same grade level, another code was dropped in the MELCs. We have here the grade level standards for force and energy and earth and space. Learner can describe how objects move and what makes them move. They can also identify sources and describe uses of light, heat, sound, and electricity. Learner can describe changes in the condition become more nature. Now we'll look into the MELCs for this grade level standard in grade 3. In here, we see that the K-12 learning competency was rephrased. The reason was that rather than asking the learners to just list down, they were asked to describe the various uses of light, sound, heat, and electricity. 2 of the LCs has been dropped because of these reasons, written in the last column. Now, let us have a walkthrough of the MELCs. We have here the grade level standards for force and energy, earth and space. In this slide, we see that the first LC was dropped, while 2 LCs were rephrased. The reasons for these changes are reflected in the last column. We have here the grade level standards for force and energy, earth and space for grade level 5. In this slide, we see that the first LC was dropped. So with the last LC, while the second LC was rephrased. The reason for these changes are written in the last column of this slide. We have here the grade level standards for force and energy, earth and space for grade 6. In this slide, we see that the first LC was rephrased and revised, while the second LC was dropped. These reasons, the LC was expounded to include effects of both rotation and revolution. It was dropped because this partly subsumed in the LC manipulates simple machines to describe their characteristics and uses. For junior high school, grade 7, level standards, force and energy, earth and space. Learner can describe the motion of objects in terms of distance and speed and represent this in tables, graphs, charts, and equations. They can describe how various forms of energy travel through different mediums. Learner describe what makes up the Philippines as a whole and the resources found in the archipelago. They can explain the occurrence of breezes, monsoons, and ITCZ, and how these weather systems affect people. They can explain why seasons change and demonstrate how eclipses occur. The first LC is being rephrased and revised. The second and the third were dropped due to the following reason. The intention of the LC for the students to discover the wave characteristics that define color and intensity and energy. Map reading and landforms, bodies of water, are already discussed in AP. The third LC is dropped since it was subsumed in the discussion on the difference between speed and velocity and distance and displacement. This slide shows the grade level standard competency for grade 8 for force and energy, earth and space. The first LC was rephrased, same as the third LC. The second LC was dropped, and the following reasons were reflected in the last column of this slide. In this slide is the grade level standards for grade 9 for force and energy, earth and space. For science grade 9, the first LC was revised. The second and the third were dropped. The reasons: the LC is expounded to include volcanic eruption, which is one way of classifying volcanoes. The second and the third were dropped due to the topic is already subsumed in the discussion about observable constellations on a specific time of the year. Grade 10 level standards, force and energy, earth and space. At the end of grade 10, learners realize that volcanoes and earthquakes occur in the same places in the world and that these are related to plate boundaries. They can demonstrate ways to ensure safety and reduce damage during earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions. Learners can explain the factors affecting the balance and stability of an object to help them practice appropriate positions and movements to achieve efficiency and safety, such as in sports and dancing. They can analyze situations in which energy is harnessed for human use, whereby heat is released. In grade 10, the first and the third LCs were dropped, and the second LC was rephrased. The reason for this are all reflected in the last column of this slide. For grade level 3 standards, domain living things in their environment. At the end of grade 3, the learner can describe the functions of the different parts of the body and things that make up their surroundings, such as rocks and soil, plants and animals. In grade 3, the first LC was rephrased. Describe the parts and function of these organs of the human body. To MELCs, describe the functions of the sense organs of the human body. The reason for this, focus should be on the main function of each sense organ. The parts of the sense organs may be tackled in a much higher grade level. Scientific terms of the parts of the sense organs are not appropriate for their age. Whereas the second competency was dropped. The reason is reflected in the last column of this slide. Another LC in science grade 3 is dropped. The reason, it will be discussed in grade 4 EPP. In addition, another LC was dropped for grade 3 due to all these topics will be covered in grade 4 EPP. For grade level standards grade 4, domain living things and their environment, reflected in this slide. One LC for grade 4 was dropped since it will be covered in grade 4 health. There are two learning competencies merged and turned into one MELCs. Describe some types of beneficial and harmful interaction among living things, for the reason that the fusion of the LCs could provide students a better understanding of the organisms' interrelationships. In this slide, reflected the grade 5 level standards for living things and environment. For grade 5, two of the learning competencies were dropped, since it will be covered in grade 5 health. Here is the grade 6 level standards, living things and their environment. Learners understand how the different organ systems of the human body work together. Learners can classify plants based on reproductive structures and animals based on the presence or lack of backbone. Learners can decide and conduct an investigation on plant propagation. Learners can describe larger ecosystems such as rainforests, coral reefs, and mangrove swamps. For science grade 6, one LC is dropped since it was covered in grade 5 competency. For junior high school, grade 7 level standards, living things and their environment. After studying how organ systems work together in plants and animals in the lower grade levels, learners can use a microscope when observing very small organisms and structures. Learners recognize that living things are organized into different levels: cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and organisms. These organisms comprise populations and communities which interact with non-living things in ecosystems. For grade 7, two LCs were dropped since it could be tackled in grade 8 and it was discussed in grade 5. For grade 8 level standards, living things and their environment is reflected in this slide. In grade 8, only one LC was dropped since it was covered in grade 6, third quarter, and grade 7, health, second quarter. In this slide shows the grade 9 level standards for the living things in their environment. For science grade 9, only one LC was dropped since it was covered in a grade 8 competency. This slide shows the grade 10 level standards on living things in their environment. For grade 10, only one LC was dropped since it was covered in grade 8. For the senior high school, core subject description for Earth and Life Science, this learning area is designed to provide a general background for the understanding of Earth science and biology. It presents the history of the Earth through geologic time. It discusses the Earth's structure, composition, and processes. Issues, concerns, and problems pertaining to natural hazards are also included. It highlighted and deals with the basic principles and processes in the study of biology. It covers life, population, and ecosystem levels. To name a few, describe classic experiments that model conditions which may have enabled the first forms to evolve. This LC could be subsumed under Science 11 or 12, Living Things, Quarter 2, Week 1, competency number 1. Explain the evolving concept of life based on emerging pieces of evidence. Other ELSIs dropped were shown in this slide. Here are the examples of the learning competencies dropped in Earth and Life Science. Reflected here are the ELSIs dropped due to the following reasons: that it was captured in grade 5. These are the ELSIs dropped for the Earth and Life Science for the following reasons. Reflected in this slide are the ELSIs dropped for Earth and Life Science due to the reason that it was covered in grade 10. A sample of ELSI dropped for Earth and Life Science because it was captured in junior high school. Another ELSI dropped due to the reason that it was captured in grades 5 to 7. For senior high school, General Biology 1 and 2. Biology 1. This subject designed to enhance the understanding of the principles and concepts in the study of biology, particularly life processes at the cellular and molecular levels. It also covers the transformation of energy in organisms. Biology 2. This subject is designed to enhance the understanding of the principles and concepts in the study of biology, particularly heredity and variation, and the diversity of living organisms, their structure, function, and evolution. For Biology 1, 6 ELSIs were dropped. An example of this: discuss crossing over and recombination in meiosis. MELCs describe the stages of mitosis and meiosis given the 2n equals 6. For the reason, it is subsumed in STEM Bio 1112 with this code. Here are the other ELSIs dropped for biology. For Biology 2, there are 4 ELSIs were dropped due to it is covered in grade 8, in grade 9, and in grade 10. As well as there are 2 ELSIs were merged into one MELC, and that maintain steady internal conditions such as temperature regulation, osmotic balance, and glucose levels that possess various structures and processes. For grade 3 level standards, domain matter. They can classify these things as solid, liquid, or gas. Learners can describe changes in the conditions of their surroundings. This would lead learners to become more curious about their surroundings, appreciate nature, and practice health and safety measures. For grade 3, 2 ELSIs were dropped, 1 retained in MELCs, for the reason that the ELSI had already been introduced partly in earlier grades, and students to classify objects based on observable characteristics similar to the retained ELSI. This can form part of an activity to reinforce the ELSI. In this slide, grade 4 level standard domain matter is reflected. For science grade 4, 2 ELSIs were dropped for the reason that it is subsumed in grade 6 health. In this slide, shows the grade level standards for grade 5 matter. For science grade 5, only 1 ELSI was dropped. It is because it is subsumed in the ELSI, design a product out of local recyclable solid and or liquid materials in making useful products. This slide reflects the grade 6 level standards for matter. For science grade 6, 2 LCs were retained, 2 rephrased to MELCs, and 1 LC dropped. For the reason that revised to require the learner to describe the various separation techniques, which requires a higher level cognitive demand than just recognizing them. The LC was dropped. This can be learned along with the second LC, as learners are directed to describe various separation techniques. Grade 7 level standards matter. At the end of grade 7, learners can distinguish mixtures from substances through semi-guided investigation. They realize the importance of fair testing when conducting investigations. For grade level 7, all LCs were retained. For grade 8 matter, learners can explain the behavior of matter in terms of the particles it is made of. They recognize that ingredients in food and medical products are made up of these particles and absorbed by the body in the form of ions. One LC was deleted, 2 retained in science grade 8, for the reason that LC can be merged with the succeeding LC, as students are directed to make use of the periodic table to determine the properties of elements. Grade 9 level standards matter. Learners can explain how new materials are formed when atoms are rearranged. They recognize that a wide variety of useful compounds may arise from such rearrangement. Science grade 9. 1 LC was dropped, 2 LCs were merged, and all the reasons were reflected in the last column of this slide. For grade level 10, standards matter. Learners can explain the importance of controlling the conditions under which a chemical reaction occurs. They recognize that cells and tissues of the human body are made up of water, a few kinds of ions, and biomolecules. These biomolecules may also be found in the food they eat. For grade 10, 1 LC was rephrased. Here, in this slide, reflects the MELCs and the reason of rephrasing. For senior high school general chemistry 1 and 2, composition, structure, and properties of matter, quantitative principles, kinetics, and energetics of transformations of matter, and fundamental concepts of organic chemistry. For general chemistry 1, 5 LCs were dropped and 2 LCs rephrased. The following reasons are all reflected in these slides. Here is the list of the competency dropped and rephrased in general chemistry 1. In general chemistry 2, 3 LCs were dropped and 2 LCs rephrased. All the reasons are reflected in this slide. This slide shows the rephrase and drop competencies, and all reasons are reflected in the last column of this slide. Core subject description, physical science. Evolution of our understanding of matter, motion, electricity, magnetism, light, and the universe from ancient times to the present. Applications of physics and chemistry concepts in contexts such as atmospheric phenomena, cosmology, astronomy, vision, medical instrumentation, space technology, drugs, sources of energy, pollution, recycling, fitness and health, and cosmetics. For physical science, 6 learning competencies were dropped. for the reason that the basic concepts are already taught in junior high school. This slide shows the drop competencies, and the reasons are all reflected in the last column of this slide. Senior high school Earth Science. This learning area is designed to provide a general background for the understanding of the Earth on a planetary scale. It presents the history of the Earth through geologic time. It discusses the Earth's structure and composition, the processes that occur beneath and on the Earth's surface, as well as issues, concerns, and problems pertaining to Earth's resources. For Earth and Space, 3 LCs were dropped for the reasons that the same concept is already introduced in Araling Panlipunan, and the topic had been discussed extensively in Science Grade 8 and 10 in the junior high school, respectively. Junior high school DRRR. This course focuses on the application of scientific knowledge and the solution of practical problems in a physical environment. It is designed to bridge the gap between theoretical science and daily living. For the senior high school specialization Earth Science, 3 LCs were dropped. For the reason, the concept is subsumed in the discussion of exposure to hazards and being introduced in Science Grade 6, and subsumed in the prior LC, where discusses various volcano-related hazards. For General Physics 1 and 2, Physics 1, Mechanics of Particles, Rigid Bodies and Fluids, Waves, and Heat and Trigonometry, Graphical Analysis, and Basic Calculus. For Physics 2, Electricity and Magnetism, Optics, the Basics of Special Relativity, Atomic and Nuclear Phenomena, using the methods and concepts of algebra, geometry, trigonometry, graphical analysis, and basic calculus. This slide shows the drop competencies for General Physics 1, and all the reasons are reflected in the last column of this slide. For General Physics 2, 6 LCs were dropped for the reason that this topic is subsumed in the prior LC, where discusses electrostatic charging. Ohm's law is already introduced in grade 6, and there is no sufficient laboratory equipment provided yet to schools to carry out the activity. Now let us look on how to use the MELCs. But we must remember that MELCs are the same LCs, but only trimmed down. We have 3 things to consider. First, MELCs must be unpacked because they are broad statements. Second, MELCs must be aligned to the content standards and performance standards of the science curriculum. And lastly, time allocation for targeting of the MELCs must be flexible. Here, let us look at the grade 8 first quarter using MELCs. Time allocation, week 2 to 3. For the content standard, the learners demonstrate understanding of work using constant force, power, gravitational potential energy, kinetic energy, and elastic potential energy. We will consider the performance standard. The learner should be able to develop a written plan and implement a Newton's Olympics. And for the MELCs, identify and explain the factors that affect potential and kinetic energy. Here is the grade 8 first quarter sample and packed MELC to learning objectives. A. Define and differentiate potential and kinetic energy. B. Identify the factors that affect potential energy. C. Determine the mathematical variation between potential energy and mass and height from the ground. D. Compare the values of potential energy of varying masses at the same elevation from the ground. Letter E. Identify the factors that affect kinetic energy. F. Determine the mathematical variation between kinetic energy and mass and velocity. G. Create and explain a concept map involving the terms kinetic energy, potential energy, mass, velocity, and elevation. And last, demonstrate and explain the law of conservation of energy using a pendulum. As reflected in this slide, the sample and pack MELCs to learning objectives directly responds to the content standard of the science curriculum and performance standard. As reflected in the yellow box, response to the content standard demonstrate understanding of potential energy, kinetic energy, and that is explicitly reflected in learning objectives letter A to letter G. And the second one, allowing students to manipulate a pendulum would help the students prepare for the performance standard, plan for Newton's Olympic, and it is reflected in objective letter H.
Part, I would like to summarize some key points in this orientation of the most important learning competencies. First, the key stage and grade level standards are retained. Second, the most essential learning competencies are not departures of the K-12 basic education science curriculum. Third, it retains the same vision of developing scientific, technological, and environmental literacy. Last, the learning competencies were trimmed down to the most essential competencies. In the end, according to Hans A. Bethe, we need science education to produce scientists, but we need it equally to create literacy in the public. Thank you so much, and I hope we have a clear understanding of the importance of the most essential learning competencies in this new normal. I also hope that we can make the best out of our learners during these trying times. Good luck and God bless us all. Mabuhay tayong lahat.
Magandang araw sa inyong lahat. Sa aming direktor, si Dr. Evelyn R. Petalbero, CESO 4, gayon din sa aming Assistant Regional Director, Dr. Maria Ines C. Asuncion, CESO 5. Sa aming Hepe, si Dr. Janet J. Veloso para sa Curriculum and Learning Management Division. Gayon din sa Bureau of Curriculum Development, kay Dr. Rosalie Masilang, salamat sa kopya tungkol sa pinakamahalagang pamantayan sa pagkatuto. Gayon din sa kanyang mga specialist. Higit sa lahat, magandang araw sa mga kasamahan ko sa Araling Panlipunan. Gayon din sa ating mga guro sa Rehiyon 11. Ang tatalakayin natin sa araw na ito ay kung paano binuo ang pinakamahalagang pamantayan sa pagkatuto sa Araling Panlipunan, o mas kilala sa acronym na MELC o MELC. Tingnan natin ang naging kasaysayan sa pagkabuo ng MELC sa Araling Panlipunan. Una, nagkaroon ng curriculum review. Ang ating mga dalubhasa ay tiningnang maigi ang curriculum mula sa elementarya hanggang sa sekundarya. Pinag-aralan ang curriculum guide, gayon din ang curriculum standard. kung saan napapaloob ang learning competencies. Mula sa learning competencies, nabuo ang essential learning competencies. At mula naman sa essential learning competencies, nabuo ang most essential learning competencies. Ano-ano nga ba ang mga basihan sa pagkabuo ng most essential learning competencies? Una, kinakailangan na ang learning competency na ito ay panghabang buhay. Kinakailangan din na ito ay buo, malinaw, at may malawak na kaalaman. Higit sa lahat, ito ay naaayon sa pamantayang pangnilalaman at pamantayan sa pagganap. Bakit nabuo ang MELC o yung tinatawag nating pinakamahalagang pamantayan sa pagkatuto? Una, upang matulungan ang mga guro na matukoy ang mahahalagang pamantayang pampagkatuto upang sa gayon ay mabigyan ito ng prioridad. Pangalawa, maging batayan sa kanilang mga desisyong instruksyonal at hindi upang palitan ang kasalukuyang curriculum guide. Tingnan natin ang kabuang bilang ng pamantayang pampagkatuto sa araling panlipunan mula grado 1 hanggang 10. Sa kasalukuyan, mayroon tayong tinatawag na 253 na most essential learning competencies. Ang most essential learning competencies ay mula sa 336 na tinatawag nating essential learning competencies. Ito naman ay galing sa 507 na mga learning competencies mula sa ginagamit natin na curriculum guide. Mula sa 507 patungong essential learning competencies na 336, mayroong 171 na learning competencies na nawala o di kaya'y isinama sa ibang learning competencies o binago. Mula naman sa 336, nagkaroon na lamang tayo ngayon ng 253. Nasaan ang 83 na essential learning competencies? Ito ay posibleng inalis din o di kaya isinama sa kapwa essential learning competencies. Tingnan naman natin ang isa pang datos kung saan ipinakita ang pagbabago ng mga learning competencies patungong most essential learning competencies sa bawat taon. Halimbawa, sa unang taon o sa unang grado, noon mayroong 63 na mga learning competencies mula sa curriculum guide. Ngunit binawasan ito o di kaya tinanggal o pinag-isa para mabuo ang tinatawag nating essential learning competencies. Mula sa 63, naging 31 na lamang ito. Pero naging 29 pa nang mabuo natin ang most essential learning competencies. Sa makatuwid, may 2 essential learning competencies na pinag-isa at tinanggal. Ito naman ay saring datos na nagpapakita sa porsyento ng mga learning competencies at essential learning competencies na nabago, naisama at natanggal. Halimbawa, sa baitang 1, ang current learning competencies natin ay 63 at ang essential learning competencies natin ay 31. Sa kasalukuyan, mayroon tayong 29 pero tinatawag natin itong most essential learning competencies. Sa makatuwid, mula sa learning competencies patungong essential learning competencies, mayroon tayong 50.79% na mga learning competencies na nawala o napasama. Gayon din sa essential learning competencies patungong most essential learning competencies na kung saan mayroon tayong 3.18% na mga competencies na nawala o napasama. Ano-ano nga ba ang mga pananda upang pag-isahin natin, tanggalin, o di kaya maiba ang anyo ng ating mga learning competencies? Pag sinasabi nating retained, itinuturing na essential ang learning competency, kaya hindi nirebisa o nananatili sa dati nitong anyo o artikulasyon tulad ng makikita natin sa K-12 curriculum guide. Pag sinasabi naman nating merge, ang mga learning competencies na ito ay magkakaugnay, magkakahilintulad o bahagi ng isang paksa na pinag-isa na lamang sa pamamagitan ng pagbuo ng panibagong learning competency. Kung i-rephrase naman natin, ito ay sumailalim sa pagpapalit ng learning verb o di kaya ng salita o grupo ng mga salita upang gawing tiyak, malinaw at komprehensibo ang naturang competency. Kapag ito ay subsume, magkakaugnay, magkakahalintulad o bahagi ng isang paksa na ipinagpapalagay na nakapaluloob sa nag-iisang independent na competency. Kung ito naman ay tinanggal, ang ibig sabihin nito, hindi isinama sa ibang uri ng competency dahil ito ay hindi esensyal at ang pagtatanggal dito ay halos walang epekto sa pagkakamit ng pamantayang pangnilalaman at pagganap. Upang mas lalo nating maintindihan kung bakit pinag-isa ang magkakaparihong mga learning competencies at mabuo ang most essential learning competencies, gayon din ang ugnayan ng most essential learning competencies sa tinatawag nating pamantayan sa pagkatuto, pamantayan sa nilalaman o di kaya sa pagganap. Tingnan natin ang ilan sa mga halimbawa mula sa elementarya. Makikita natin sa unang markahan para sa grado 1. Ang content standard o ang pamantayang pangnilalaman ay naipamamalas ang pag-unawa sa kahalagaan ng pagkikilala o pagkilala sa sarili bilang Pilipino gamit ang konsepto ng pagpapatuloy at pagbabago. Sa makatuwid, sa ilalim ng pamantayang pangnilalaman nito, ang mga mag-aaral ay kinakailangang mapahalagahan niya ang kanyang sarili pagkatapos ng unang markahan. Sa ilalim naman ng pamantayan sa pagganap, ang mag-aaral ay may buong pagmamalaking nakapagsasalaysay ng kwento tungkol sa sariling katangian at pagkakakilanlan bilang Pilipino sa malikhaing pamamaraan. Sa pamantayan sa pagganap, kinakailangan na ang mga mag-aaral ay maibahagi nila sa iba ang kanilang katangian bilang mga Pilipino sa iba't ibang pamaraan. Mula sa content standard at performance standard, ang Learning Competency 7 ay isinama na sa Learning Competency 6. Bakit? Dahil halos magkakapareho lamang ito. Ang Learning Competency 7 at Learning Competency 6 ay tumutukoy sa pagkatao ng isang mag-aaral, na kung saan siyang binibigyang diin natin sa pamantayang pangnilalaman at pamantayan sa pagganap. Para sa ikalawang taon, sa ikalawang markahan, alam natin na ang ating tinatawag na pamantayang pangnilalaman ay naipamamalas ang pag-unawa sa kwento ng pinagmulan ng sariling komunidad batay sa konsepto ng pagbabago at pagpapatuloy at pagpapahalaga sa kulturang nabuo ng komunidad. Ang tinatawag naman nating pamantayan sa pagganap ay nauunawaan ang pinagmulan at kasaysayan ng komunidad. Gayon din, nabibigyang halaga ang mga bagay na nagbago at nananatili sa pamumuhay sa komunidad. Sa ilalim nito, kinakailangang mapahalagahan ng mga mag-aaral ang mga bagay sa kanilang komunidad. Kung kaya't, pinag-isa ang tatlong learning competencies. Ano-ano ang mga ito? Ang Learning Competency 4 at Learning Competency 3 ay pinag-isa sa Learning Competency 2. Bakit? Dahil halos magkakapareho itong tumutukoy sa pinagmulan ng komunidad. Dumako naman tayo sa ikatlong grado. Halimbawa, sa ikatlong markahan. Ang ating pamantayang pangnilalaman ay naipamamalas ang pag-unawa at pagpapahalaga sa pagkakakilanlang kultural ng kinabibilangang rehiyon. Ang ating pamantayan sa pagganap ay nakapagpapahayag ng may pagmamalaki at pagkikilala sa nabubuong kultura ng mga lalawigan sa kinabibilangang rehiyon. Sa makatuwid, sa ilalim nito, ang mga mag-aaral sa ikatlong grado ay dapat maunawaan nila at maipakita sa iba ang mga nakagisnang kultura nila, mga kultura na nakuha at namana nila mula sa kanilang rehiyon, ang rehiyon ng Davao. Dahil dito, ang 5 competencies ay naging isa. Itong nailalarawan ang pagkakakilanlang kultura ng sariling lalawigan, na isa-isa ang mga pangkat ng mga tao sa sariling lalawigan at rehiyon, nakapagbibigay ng mga halimbawang salita mula sa mga wika at dialekto sa sariling lalawigan at rehiyon. Gayon din ang nailalarawan ang mga kaugalian, paniniwala at tradisyon ng sariling lalawigan at ng rehiyon ay may pari-parihong tinutumbok. Kung kaya't, maaari na itong gawing isahan at ito ay ang nailalarawan ang pagkakakilanlang kultural ng kinabibilangang rehiyon. Dumako naman tayo sa ika-4 na grado. Halimbawa, sa unang markahan, alam natin na ang pamantayang pangnilalaman ay naipamamalas ng ating mga mag-aaral ang konsepto ng bansa. Gayon din ang pag-unawa sa pagkakakilanlan ng mga bansa ayon sa mga katangiang geographical gamit ang mapa. Ang pamantayan sa pagganap naman ay naipaliliwanag ng mga mag-aaral na ang Pilipinas ay isang bansa. Gayon din ang kasanayan sa paggamit ng mapa sa pagtukoy ng iba't ibang lalawigan at rehiyon. Dahil dito, kinakailangang manatili ang ating unang learning competency na mula pa sa curriculum guide dahil natumbok na niya ang ating pamantayang pangnilalaman, gayon din ang ating pamantayan sa pagganap. At ang competency na natutukoy sa mapa ang kinalalagyan ng bansa sa rehiyong Asya at gayon din sa mundo ay hindi na kinakailangan dahil maaaring makamit na ang kasanayang gusto nating makamtan ng ating mga mag-aaral sa unang competency. Dumako naman tayo sa grade 5. Halimbawa, sa unang markahan, ang pamantayang pangnilalaman, yun din ang pamantayan sa pagganap, ay maaari nang matumbok ng ating learning competency na natatalakay ang paglaganap ng relihiyong Islam sa ibang bahagi ng bansa. Dapat tandaan natin na ang learning competency na nailalarawan ang lokasyon ng Pilipinas sa mapa ay hindi na masyadong mahalaga dahil maaaring makamtan pa rin natin ang pamantayang pangnilalaman, gayon din ang pamantayan sa pagganap sa iba pang mga dating competency. Sa grade 6, ganun din. Alam natin na ito lamang ang dapat mabuo sa ating mga mag-aaral, ang pag-unawa at kaalaman sa Pilipinas. Sa ilalim ng pamantayan sa pagganap, kinakailangan lamang na mapapahalagan ng ating mga mag-aaral ang kontribusyon ng ating bansa sa daigdig o di kaya sa ating mundo. Kung kaya't natumbok na ng learning competency number 4 at ito ay natatalakay ang partisipasyon ng mga kababaihan sa Rebolusyong Pilipino. Kaya maaari nang tanggalin ang dati nating learning competency na nasa bilang una. Dumako naman tayo sa sekundarya. Sa sekundarya, mayroon itong 81 na mga learning competency mula sa curriculum guide. Para sa grade 8, mayroon itong 43 na mga learning competency. Sa grade 9, mayroon itong 82 na mga learning competencies. Gayon din sa grade 10 na umabot sa 42. Ngunit dahil sa ating hinaharap ngayon sa COVID-19, nabawasan o di kaya pinagsanib ang halos magkakaparihong learning competencies. Kung kaya't ang naging resulta ay umabot lamang sa 43 mula 81. Sa grade 8, mayroon na lamang tayong 31 mula 43. Sa grade 9, mayroon na lamang tayong 62 mula 82 at 31 mula 42. Ngunit, nagkaroon muli ng panibagong learning competency na tinatawag nating most essential learning competency. Kung kaya't nabawasan muli ang ating mga essential learning competencies. Sa kasalukuyan, ang baitang 7 ay mayroon na lamang 30 learning competencies na tinatawag natin ngayong most essential learning competencies. Sa grade 8, mayroon na lamang tayong 24 na learning competencies na tinatawag nating most essential learning competencies. Gayon din sa grade 9 na umabot na lamang sa 26 at grade 10 na umabot na lamang sa 17. tingnan natin ang ilan sa mga halimbawa ng mga learning competencies na pinagsanib, pinag-isa, tinanggal, or nananatili ayon sa mga nabanggit kong batayan. Sa grade 7, ang pamantayang pangnilalaman ay naipamamalas ng mag-aaral ang pag-unawa sa ugnayan ng kapaligiran, sinaunang kabias ng Asyano. Sa makatuwid, sa ilalim ng grade 7, dapat mabuo lamang sa isipan ng ating mga mag-aaral na may kaugnayan ang tao at ang kanilang paligid sa paghubog ng sinaunang kabias ng Asyano. Sa ilalim ng pamantayan sa pagganap, kinakailangan na napag-uugnay-ugnay ng ating mga mag-aaral ang ginampanan ng kapaligiran at tao sa paghubog ng sinaunang kabias ng Asyano. Dahil dito, tinanggal ang learning competency na nakakagawa ng pangkalatang profile ng geografiya ng Asya. Bakit? Dahil maaari na itong isama sa unang competency natin na naipapaliwanag ang konsepto ng Asya tungkol sa paghahating geograpiko. Ito ay tumutukoy sa ating kapaligiran. Gayon din ang learning competency 8 na kung saan naipapahayag ng ating mga mag-aaral ang kahalagahan ng pangangalaga sa timbang na kalagayang ekolohiko ng rehiyon. Sa learning competency na ito, may pakikialam na ang tao at isa ito sa mga humuhubog sa pagkakaroon ng kabiasnan o pagbabago. Gayon din sa grade 8 na kung saan ilan sa mga dating learning competencies ay pinag-isa. May nananatili at mayroon namang binago. Sa grade 9 ay gayon din. Mula sa content standard at performance standard, may mga pinag-isang learning competencies. Kagaya ng nakita natin sa una, pangalawa, pangatlo, at pang-apat na bilang. Dahil halos magkakapareho lamang ito, kaya maaring mabuo ang nag-iisang learning competency. Sa grade 10, dapat lamang bibigyang diin ng ating mga mag-aaral na kinakailangan malaman nila ang kahalagahan at ang kanilang pakikilahok sa mga gawaing pansibiko tungo sa pagkakaroon ng pamayanan at bansang maunlad, mapayapa at may pagkakaisa. Dahil dito, ilan sa mga competencies natin ay pinag-isa para naman mapaikli ang bilang ng mga tatahaking competency. Mula sa sekundarya, dumako naman tayo sa senior high school, sa core specialized subjects. For grade 11, ang content standard ay kinakailangang ma-demonstrate ng ating mga mag-aaral ang kanilang understanding sa social differences, social change, at political identities. Ganon din ang significance ng culture, society, and politics. At ang rationale for studying anthropology, political science, and sociology. Para matumbok natin ito, kinakailangang i-rephrase na lamang ang ating pangalawang learning competencies. At ang unang learning competencies ay pwedeng hindi na ito gagamitin ng ating mga guro. Dahil sa pangalawang learning competency na kung saan binago lamang natin ang anyo para maging most essential learning competency, ay matutulungan na ang sumunod na mga learning competencies para maisakatuparan ang minimithi nating layunin na mabuo sa isipan ng ating mga mag-aaral. Sa grade 12 naman, binibigyang diin lamang dito ang konteksto at ang iba't ibang relihiyon na kung saan sa ilalim ng performance standard dapat ang ating mga mag-aaral ay maipakita lamang nila na naimpluwensyahan ng relihiyon ang kanilang mga gawi o di kaya ang kanilang mga kultura. Kung kaya't maaari na itong makamtan sa pamamagitan ng pagsasanib sa ilan sa mga learning competency na be aware that Islam upholds 5 pillars, know about the life of Prophet Muhammad, and accept Islam practices with an eye of respect. Sa pamamagitan ng pagbabagong anyo ng ikalawang competency, matutulungan na ang ikatlong competency para mabuo ang konteksto ng iba't ibang relihiyon. Sa makatwid, hindi na kinakailangan pang manatili ang unang learning competency. Paano gagamitin ang most essential learning competencies sa pagtuturo? Alam ko na alam ng ating mga guro na may mga most essential learning competency na hindi maaaring ituro sa ating mga mag-aaral sa loob ng 2 araw. Ito ang dahilan kung bakit gumagawa ang ating mga guro ng tinatawag nating learning objectives. O kinakailangang i-unpack ng ating mga guro ang most essential learning competency para mahimay-himay nila ang most essential learning competency. Sa pagkakaroon ng iba't ibang layunin sa kanilang pagtuturo mula sa most essential learning competencies, matuturuan natin ang ating mga guro na mapaganda nila ang kanilang pagtuturo at madaling makuha ang ninanais nilang kasanayang mabuo sa ating mga mag-aaral. Isa rin itong halimbawa na kung saan ang most essential learning competency ay hinimay-himay ng mga dalubhasa. At ito ang tinatawag nating learning objectives. Gayun din sa learning competency na nasasabi ang batayang impormasyon tungkol sa sarili, pangalan, magulang, karawan, edad, tirahan, paralan, at iba pang pagkakakilanlan at mga katangian bilang mga Pilipino. Ang learning competency na ito ay malawak at hindi maaring ituro sa ating mga mag-aaral sa loob ng 1 araw. Kung kaya't, para mas lalong maintindihan ng ating mga mag-aaral o makikita ng ating mga mag-aaral ang kahalagahan ng competency na ito, kinakailangan nating i-unpack o magkakaroon tayo ng mga learning objectives. Ang sumunod ay isang halimbawa ng DLL. Ipinakita dito kung paano bumuo ang isang guro ng objective o paano na-unpack ng isang guro ang most essential learning competency. Muli, ginawa ng guro ang pagkakaroon ng objective o layunin dahil ang most essential learning competency ay hindi maisasagawa sa loob lamang ng 1 araw o posibleng hindi makikita ng ating mga mag-aaral ang kahalagahan ng learning competency na ito. kinakailangang himay-himayin kapag ang most essential learning competency ay masyadong malawak. Muli, para sa ating mga guro, dapat lang natandaan natin na ang ating ginagawa ay para sa ating mga mag-aaral. Nabuo ang pinakamahalagang pamantayan sa pagkatuto para sa araling panlipunan para mapanatili nating maibigay o magkakaroon ng sapat na kasanayan ang ating mga mag-aaral kahit na hinaharap natin ang COVID-19 sa kasalukuyan. Mga guro, tulungan ninyo ako para maging maganda at mapapahalagahan ng ating mga mag-aaral ang kanilang kasaysayan o ang kanilang lipunan. Tandaan, mahalaga ang gampanin ng araling panlipunan sa paglikha ng lipunang aral na siyang pinapangarap nating maging lipunang iral sa bansang Pilipinas. Mahal natin ang Pilipinas, mahal natin ang Pilipino, magtulungan tayo. Maraming salamat po.